It always starts small. A single letter in the mailbox, a thin white envelope with the HOA logo stamped across the corner, something most homeowners receive once in a while. Usually, it's a reminder about community updates, maybe a notice about lawn maintenance or an upcoming neighborhood event. But when I tore open that envelope, what I found was far from normal. It was a fine, $200, because apparently my trash bin had been visible on the side of my house for a single day. I remember standing there in my driveway, staring at that piece of paper, confused but not overly concerned. One fine was annoying but manageable. Everyone slips up now and then, and I assumed that would be the end of it. But I couldn't have been more wrong. That letter was only the beginning of a nightmare that would stretch across weeks, a calculated storm of harassment that came straight from the HOA board. The very next week, 2 more envelopes arrived. Another fine claimed my lawn was overgrown, even though I had just mowed it the day before. The other accused me of leaving a commercial vehicle in my driveway, a laughable claim since the vehicle in question was my perfectly normal SUV. Within days, the fines multiplied, 4 in 1 week, then 8. Soon, it was as if every time I opened my mailbox, I was pulling out another penalty slip. The reasons became more ridiculous each time. My holiday decorations were out of season. My fence was not uniform in color. My backyard shed, which had been there for years without issue, was suddenly unauthorized. By the end of the month, I had received 50 separate fines, all piling up into thousands of dollars. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the feeling of being hunted. The board members of the HOA weren't just enforcing rules, they were targeting me. Every time I left my house, I noticed board members or their so-called compliance officers circling the neighborhood, clipboards in hand, eyes locked on my property. It felt like surveillance. They wanted me to crack, to fold under the pressure, and to hand over money I didn't even owe. At first I tried reasoning with myself. Maybe it was just a mistake. Maybe someone was overzealous. Maybe if I fixed a few things, they would leave me alone. I trimmed the lawn twice a week. I tucked my trash bins deep inside the garage. I even repainted the fence just to remove their excuse. But it didn't matter. The fines kept coming. And then I realized something chilling. I wasn't the only one. A neighbor down the street whispered to me that she had been fined for planting flowers that didn't match the community palette. Another family had been accused of improper landscaping, even though their yard looked better than half the neighborhood. It became clear the HOA board had turned into a predatory machine, squeezing residents for money under the guise of community standards. The pressure built like a weight on my chest. Every day I dreaded walking to the mailbox, knowing it would contain yet another notice. Each letter felt like a slap in the face, like they were daring me to fight back. And eventually, I reached a breaking point. One night, after slamming yet another stack of fines down on my kitchen table, I decided enough was enough. I wasn't just going to sit back and let them bleed me dry. If they wanted a fight, then I would give them one. But this battle wouldn't be fought with angry phone calls or desperate pleas. It would be fought with something stronger, with the law itself. I pulled out every fine I had received, lined them up, and began to document everything. Dates, times, photographs of my property proving their claims were false, statements from neighbors who saw the harassment firsthand. I built a folder thicker than a novel, and then, with shaking hands but renewed determination, I called a lawyer. What happened next would flip the entire situation upside down. The board that had been so eager to bury me in bogus fines was about to face consequences they never imagined. And this was only the beginning. The moment I handed over that stack of fines to my lawyer, something inside me shifted. For weeks, I had been the target, the victim of harassment orchestrated by a board of petty tyrants who thought they could bury me under paperwork. But now, as I sat in his office watching him flip through the evidence, page by page, I began to see something I hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. He didn't laugh at the absurdity of the fines. He didn't dismiss my frustration. Instead, he read each document carefully, occasionally raising an eyebrow, occasionally jotting down a note. When he finally looked up, his expression wasn't one of confusion or doubt, it was of calculation. He had seen this before, he explained. HOA boards that crossed the line, abusing their authority, treating homeowners like personal ATMs. And in cases like this, there were laws to protect people like me. That night, as I drove home, I thought about how differently the board must have seen things. They likely assumed I was alone, cornered, with no one to turn to. They believed that by burying me in enough bogus fines, they could break me. But they were wrong. I had something far stronger than their harassment. A professional who knew how to dismantle their scheme piece by piece. The first step my lawyer took was simple but effective, a formal letter. It wasn't just a generic complaint, it was a carefully crafted document outlining, in detail, the harassment I had endured. Each fine was listed, cross-referenced with photos and evidence proving the claims were false. The letter demanded that the board cease their actions immediately, rescind every bogus fine, and issue a written apology, or face legal consequences. It was sent by certified mail, so there was no way they could claim ignorance. The ball was now in their court, and for the first time in weeks, I wasn't dreading what might show up in my mailbox. When the board received the letter, the reaction was almost immediate. Instead of stopping their harassment, they doubled down. Within days, more fines appeared, this time with sharper language. They accused me of defiance, of refusing to comply with community standards. They threatened liens, foreclosure, even legal action of their own. But here's the thing about bullies. They push harder when they sense resistance, but they never expect someone to push back harder. My lawyer wasn't surprised. He told me this was a common tactic: intimidate, overwhelm, and scare homeowners into submission. But unlike most, I wasn't standing alone anymore. The second letter my lawyer drafted was even more devastating. This time, it wasn't just a demand. It was a legal notice. It outlined the concept of harassment, cited state statutes the board had violated, and threatened a lawsuit for damages if the behavior continued. It also demanded full disclosure of the HOA's financial records, including where all the fine money was going. That was the part that really shook them. Because here's what most people don't realize. When an HOA is corrupt, the fines aren't just about rules. They're often about funneling money into the pockets of those in power. And when my lawyer asked for those records, it was like shining a flashlight into a dark, roach-infested corner. They scrambled. For the first time, the fines stopped arriving. My mailbox was empty, and that emptiness felt like victory. But I knew this wasn't over. The board wasn't going to roll over and admit defeat. They were silent because they were regrouping, trying to figure out their next move. During that lull, I began noticing something I hadn't before. Neighbors, the same ones who had quietly endured their own harassment, started approaching me. Word had spread about the lawyer, about the letters, about the pushback. People who had felt powerless for years were suddenly curious. Could they fight back too? Could they join forces? One neighbor told me she had paid thousands in fines for supposed paint color violations, even though her house had been approved years earlier. Another had been charged for improper roofing material, despite using the exact shingles the builder had provided. The stories were endless, and they all painted the same picture. The HOA wasn't enforcing community standards, it was running a racket. The board must have realized the tide was turning, because soon after, their tone shifted. Instead of fines, they began sending warnings. Instead of threats, they began sending reminders. But it was too late. The damage was done, and I wasn't interested in half measures. My lawyer was preparing the lawsuit, and every neighbor who came forward only made our case stronger. Then, one evening, as I was flipping through the latest draft of the complaint, something unexpected happened. A board member, someone I had rarely seen outside of meetings, showed up at my door. He wasn't there to apologize. He wasn't there to negotiate. He was there to intimidate. He stood on my porch, arms crossed, his words dripping with menace as he warned me about the consequences of going against the board. But intimidation only works when you don't know your rights. Instead of fear, I felt a surge of determination. I didn't respond, I didn't argue, I simply documented the encounter and added it to the growing folder of evidence. Every move they made was digging their hole deeper, and they didn't even realize it. As the lawsuit neared filing, I could almost feel the shift in the neighborhood. What once had been a climate of fear was turning into one of defiance. Neighbors who had kept their heads down were starting to talk, to share, to question why they had been silent for so long. The HOA's grip was loosening, and they were desperate to hold on. And then came the breaking point, the moment that would turn the entire community against them and set the stage for their downfall. It started with a mistake, a single email sent by the HOA president to the wrong distribution list. Instead of going just to the board, it went to dozens of homeowners. And in that email, clear as day, was proof that the fines weren't about rules at all. They were about revenue. The president bragged about how much money they had collected in fines, how they planned to use it to cover administrative costs, and even how targeting certain troublesome homeowners could help keep the budget balanced. It was the smoking gun we had been waiting for, and it had landed in everyone's inbox. From that moment on, there was no turning back. The board had overplayed its hand, and the entire neighborhood knew it. The lawsuit was about to hit them like a wrecking ball, and the community that once cowered under their authority was now standing behind me. But this fight wasn't finished. The HOA still had tricks left to play, and they weren't about to surrender without a battle. The war was just beginning, and the next chapter would decide everything. The leaked emails spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By the next morning, everyone was talking about it. Homeowners who had quietly endured years of harassment finally had proof that the fines weren't about community standards at all. They were about money. The HOA president's words were damning, a confession laid out in black and white for every resident to see. And as inboxes filled with angry replies and threads of frustration, the once untouchable board suddenly found itself on the defensive. For me, that email was the final puzzle piece. With the lawsuit already prepared, my lawyer wasted no time. The complaint was officially filed, and within days the board was served. Each member received the thick envelope that spelled out in painstaking detail how they had harassed, intimidated, and exploited homeowners for profit. The charges weren't just about voiding the bogus fines. They included claims of harassment, abuse of authority, and even potential financial misconduct. The board's arrogance had blinded them to just how much evidence was stacked against them. My folder of documentation, the testimony from neighbors, the photographs, and now the accidental confession, all of it was submitted. It wasn't just my case anymore. It was the case of the entire neighborhood. The news hit them like a hammer. Almost immediately, their polished confidence began to crack. Emergency board meetings were called. Emails flew back and forth. Rumors spread that some members wanted to resign, while others pushed to fight tooth and nail. But it didn't matter what they wanted. The lawsuit was in motion, and the legal machine had started grinding forward. The first hearing was a surreal experience. I walked into the courthouse with my lawyer at my side, heart pounding, palms sweating. For weeks I had envisioned this moment, but the reality was even more intense. The board members sat across from us, stiff and defensive, their lawyer whispering hurriedly in their ears. The smugness they once wore like armor was gone, replaced with thinly veiled panic. When my lawyer began laying out the evidence, the courtroom fell silent. He walked the judge through the timeline, 50 fines in 30 days, each more absurd than the last. He presented photos of my freshly mowed lawn, my SUV parked neatly in the driveway, my fence in perfect condition, all disproving the fines. He held up the email, the smoking gun, and read aloud the words that revealed their true intentions. The effect was devastating. The board's lawyer tried to object, tried to argue that the fines were valid and that the HOA had the authority to enforce its rules, but each argument crumbled under the weight of the evidence. Every claim they made was met with documented proof to the contrary. And when my lawyer presented affidavits from other neighbors who had suffered the same harassment, the case stopped being about one homeowner and became a collective indictment of the board itself. Outside the courthouse, the community was buzzing. Neighbors who had once kept their distance now approached me with nods of encouragement. Some even attended the hearings, sitting quietly in the back as silent witnesses to what we were all enduring. The atmosphere was shifting. The fear that the HOA had relied on for so long was dissolving, replaced by a shared determination to hold them accountable. But the board wasn't going to roll over. After that first hearing, they launched a counterattack. They began sending newsletters claiming the lawsuit was frivolous, that I was a troublemaker trying to destroy the community. They painted themselves as the victims, insisting they were only trying to protect property values and maintain standards. It was desperate, and everyone could see it. The more they tried to defend themselves, the guiltier they looked. Homeowners remembered their own fines, their own harassment, and realized this wasn't about me, it was about all of us. Their smear campaign only fueled more anger, and instead of isolating me, it rallied the community around me. Meanwhile, discovery began. My lawyer requested full financial records, and after weeks of delay and resistance, the board was finally forced to turn them over. What we found was worse than anyone expected. Thousands of dollars collected from fines weren't going into community maintenance at all. They were being funneled into administrative accounts with vague descriptions that raised more questions than answers. Large sums were paid out for consulting fees, special projects, and even travel expenses for board members. The pattern was clear. They had been using fines as a slush fund, enriching themselves while neglecting the very community they claimed to protect. Streetlights were still broken, common areas were still unkempt, and yet board members were enjoying perks paid for by homeowners' misery. That revelation turned the case from harassment into potential fraud. My lawyer amended the complaint and suddenly the stakes skyrocketed. This wasn't just about my fines being rescinded. It was about accountability, restitution, and possible criminal implications. The board members who once strutted around the neighborhood now avoided eye contact. Their power was crumbling, and they knew it. As the trial date approached, the tension in the community reached its peak. Yard signs appeared. Reform the HOA. Hold them accountable. Stop the harassment. Neighbors who had been silent for years began showing up at meetings, demanding answers. The once cozy gatherings where the board ruled unchallenged turned into heated confrontations. The president's voice, once so commanding, now trembled under the weight of angry questions. And yet, even with the evidence stacked against them, the board clung to their arrogance. They believed that somehow, some way, they could outmaneuver us. They hired new lawyers, spent thousands on their defense, and doubled down on their claims that the fines were legitimate. It was denial at its most desperate. The day of the trial finally arrived. I remember walking into the courtroom and feeling the electricity in the air. Dozens of neighbors had come to watch, filling the benches, whispering among themselves as the case unfolded. The board sat at their table, pale and tense, while their lawyer shuffled papers with frantic energy. My lawyer delivered a masterful presentation. He didn't just argue the law, he told the story. He painted the picture of an HOA that had lost its way, that had turned from a protective organization into a predatory one. He showed the judge the mountain of evidence, the photographs, the testimony, the financial records, the damning email. Piece by piece, he built an unshakable case. When it was the board's turn, their defense fell flat. Their lawyer tried to argue technicalities, tried to claim that the fines were within their authority.
But the judge wasn't buying it.
The fraud, the harassment, the abuse of power, it was all too blatant. Every excuse sounded hollow compared to the overwhelming evidence. As I sat there listening, I realized something profound. This wasn't just about me winning a case, it was about standing up to a system that had bullied an entire community. It was about proving that even the most intimidating authority can be challenged when people unite and fight back. The trial stretched into the afternoon, every moment heavy with anticipation, and when it finally ended, we all knew the verdict would be the turning point. The board had gambled everything on their arrogance, and now the truth was about to catch up with them. The courtroom was silent as everyone waited for the judge's decision. Days of tension, months of harassment, and countless hours of preparation all boiled down to this single moment. The board members sat rigid in their seats, faces pale and tight, their confidence long gone. Behind me, dozens of neighbors leaned forward, holding their breath. For the first time in years, the community wasn't divided by fear. We were united by hope. The judge's voice was steady, measured, but every word hit like a hammer. He recounted the evidence, the absurd volume of fines, the lack of justification, the photographic proof, the testimonies from neighbors, and most damning of all, the email in which the HOA president openly bragged about targeting homeowners for revenue. He acknowledged the financial records that showed a disturbing misuse of funds, money funneled away from community maintenance and into questionable administrative costs. Then came the ruling. The fines against me were not only dismissed, they were declared unlawful. The HOA was ordered to reimburse every penny I had already paid, plus damages for harassment. But it didn't stop there. The judge extended the ruling to include other homeowners who had come forward, opening the door for them to seek restitution as well. And in a final, crushing blow, he demanded a full, independent audit of the HOA's finances. The board's faces said it all. What they had feared most was happening right before their eyes. Their empire of intimidation, built on fear and greed, was collapsing. The courtroom erupted in murmurs of disbelief, then applause as the ruling sank in. Neighbors hugged, some even cried. For the first time in a long time, we weren't the victims. We were victorious. But victory didn't come without consequences. For the board, at least, the audit uncovered a trail of mismanagement that shocked even the most cynical residents. Tens of thousands of dollars had been siphoned into consulting fees that went to companies tied to board members' relatives. Trips labeled as community development turned out to be vacations. Even the landscaping budget had been manipulated, with inflated contracts awarded to businesses connected to the board. The fallout was swift. The HOA president resigned in disgrace, followed by two other board members who wanted to escape before the storm hit harder. The remaining members were voted out in a special election called by the residents, an election where, for the first time, homeowners felt their voices truly mattered. In their place, a new board was elected, one made up of regular neighbors, people who had lived through the harassment and vowed to restore fairness. Transparency became the rule, not the exception. Financial reports were shared openly, fines were rare and reasonable, and community meetings actually felt like discussions instead of lectures. The change was almost immediate. For me personally, the victory was sweet, but it was also humbling. I hadn't set out to lead a revolution. I just wanted the harassment to stop. But by standing up, by refusing to fold, I had given others the courage to do the same. and together we had dismantled the stranglehold the old board had over us. Of course, the old board didn't go quietly. They tried one last desperate move, an appeal, but the higher court dismissed it almost instantly, citing the overwhelming evidence against them. With that final attempt crushed, the case was officially closed. Justice wasn't just served, it was cemented. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere in the neighborhood transformed. People who had once kept their heads down now walked proudly, waving to each other, chatting at the mailbox. Kids played in yards without parents worrying about phantom violations. Even the smallest changes felt monumental, like a community healed from years of wounds. Looking back, it's almost surreal to think how it all began, with a single fine for a trash bin left out. What seemed like a minor annoyance spiraled into a war for fairness, a battle that revealed just how corrupt and abusive a small group of people could become when given unchecked power. But it also revealed something else, that when people stand together, even the most intimidating authority can be brought down. The new board, to their credit, reached out to me directly after the dust settled. They thanked me, not just for fighting, but for setting the precedent that harassment wouldn't be tolerated. They asked for input on new policies, on how to make sure no one else ever endured what I had. For the first time, I didn't dread the sight of an HOA letter in my mailbox. Instead of fear, there was trust. Instead of punishment, there was cooperation. The HOA wasn't perfect, no organization ever is, but it had been reborn. And in that rebirth, the community finally felt like home again. The former board members, meanwhile, faded into obscurity. Some moved away, unable to face the glares and whispers of neighbors they had once ruled over. Others stayed, but kept their heads down, living quietly in the very community they had tried to exploit. They had gone from feared enforcers to disgraced outcasts, a transformation as fitting as it was satisfying. As for me, life slowly returned to normal. The stress of daily harassment was gone. The mailbox no longer felt like a trap, and though I knew I would never forget the chaos of those months, I also knew I had gained something invaluable: resilience. I had learned that silence only fuels bullies, and that sometimes the only way to stop harassment is to shine a light on it for everyone to see. And maybe that's the real lesson in all of this. HOA boards, like any authority, are supposed to serve, not to control, not to exploit, not to intimidate. When they forget that, when they overstep, it's up to homeowners to remind them. One voice can spark change, but when that voice is joined by others, it can topple even the most stubborn of tyrants. So when I look back now, I don't just remember the stress, the anger, the sleepless nights. I remember the victory. I remember the moment the judge's ruling turned the tables. I remember the applause in that courtroom, the unity in my neighborhood, the relief in finally being free from harassment. The HOA thought they could bury me under 50 fines in a single month. Instead, they buried themselves. And in the end, they paid the ultimate price for their greed, their arrogance, and their harassment. Justice wasn't just served, it was delivered with interest.